Hello, my lovely anatomists and physiologists. Michele Glass here. And we last left off with intramembranous ossification. And our job for this video is to talk about the more common type. So the more dominant or common, let's call it more common type of ossification, which is endochondral. And if we do our breakdown of the word, endo is talking about like within, and then chondral is talking about cartilage. And then of course, ossification we see is the conversion or formation of new bone. And so the significant thing here is that we are starting with our framework, which is going to be hyaline cartilage. And we mentioned that it's more common. So we're going to see pretty much everything except those few bones we mentioned in the previous video. So our book just says like base of the skull, long bones. So I think when it says base of the skull, it's talking about everything below the skull, with the exception of the clavicles, right? And so we do have some similarities in our pattern here, but we do have some differences. This one does feel a little bit more complicated. So in this case, we're going to list out the steps, look at a diagram together, and then try to come up with like the basic pattern. And so we are starting again with mesenchymal cells. So we're talking here in both cases of intramembranous and endochondral ossification, we're talking about development starting in the fetus, right? And so those mesenchymal cells, remember, are those undifferentiated cells of the fetus. So they haven't formed anything yet. So what we see here is that they will first differentiate into chondrocytes. And so the chondrocytes are making the cartilaginous template or framework. So if you remember early on, we said that in both cases of intramembranous and endochondral ossification, you have some kind of starting tissue. And then what we see happening is the matrix of the cartilage is going to calcify, and we're going to see those chondrocytes actually begin to die. Next, we see happening blood vessels penetrating. And they bring with them osteogenic cells. Osteogenic cells, we should be getting a pretty good understanding here. There are stem cells. They're going to ultimately give rise to osteoblasts, which make our bone. And then once completely surrounded by bone, those osteoblasts become called osteocytes. When we have the blood vessels coming in and penetrating, we get what's called here our primary ossification center. And this is in the diaphysis, which remember is the shaft of our long bone. So we're getting primary ossification center at the shaft. Or diaphysis. From there, we get this pattern of elongation of that bone continues. Okay, let me backtrack a little bit because I think it will actually make more sense to then say, and I'm doing kind of a abbreviation of steps here, but I think it makes more sense to go back and say, we get the blood vessel penetrating, bringing an osteogenic cells at the primary ossification center at our diaphysis. And then we basically, I'm going to just say, get a repeat of that at the epiphyses. So epiphyses is the plural form. We have two ends, a distal and a proximal epiphysis. And we call this location the secondary ossification center. So where we get the blood vessels penetrating at the epiphyses, we get a secondary ossification center. And then what we're going to see happening is elongation continues at the epiphyses. And the way that we have that is we increase our cartilage and then it's converted to bone. We're going to have a whole video on this elongation, so stay tuned for that. Okay, let's take a look next at our diagram. So with our diagram here, we're starting in the top section here. This is a diagram coming directly out of the OpenStax Anatomy and Physiology textbook. So what we see to begin with is we have a sort of really primitive embryonic skeleton, embryonic bone that's all composed of hyaline cartilage. And then what we start to see happening is at the center in the diaphysis, the cartilaginous matrix becomes calcified and chondrocytes begin to die. And in the next image, we see the blood vessel penetrating into the diaphysis, bringing with it osteogenic cells, forming that primary ossification center. So we start to see that bone forming first at the diaphysis. And we see spongy bone forming, making that medullary cavity, putting those blood vessels really into that diaphysis. And then we begin to see the secondary ossification center when we get blood vessels penetrating the epiphyses. And that bone is continuing to elongate by forming cartilage that's then converted to bone. And all of that elongation is happening at that place that we mentioned as being the epiphyseal plate. So epiphyseal plate is another term for talking about epiphyseal cartilage. In common terms, we might call it a growth plate. I won't use that terminology officially, so make sure you're thinking about epiphyseal plate, epiphyseal cartilage, or you might also realize that this is located at that place that we mentioned as being called the metaphysis. Notice too that your bone started out as cartilage and that articular cartilage remains. So the articular cartilage is there from the origin and is never converted into bone. So that's how we actually get that articular cartilage. Let's try to sort of break this down into sort of an easy pattern. So I would start by saying the matrix is mineralized. Mineralized is a fancy word of saying calcified. So this is the addition, you know, a cartilaginous matrix is going to have collagen fibers. The thing that makes that different from bone is the mineralization. So we're talking about calcium phosphate, we're talking about calcium carbonate, we're basically talking about those hydroxyapatite crystals. And that's what's being added really by those osteoblasts. We're going to get death to chondrocytes next. So when we talk very first about the matrix being mineralized, that's not the job of osteoblasts. They're not there yet. When we start to get that matrix mineralized, that's contributing to the death of those chondrocytes that were the starting cells. The third step is the invasion of blood vessels. And now, with the invasion of blood vessels, we get, I'm going to put in parentheses, our osteogenic cells coming in. And the invasion of blood vessels is from the periosteum. And then the fourth major step we can say here is that seeding of osteogenic cells. I like this phrasing, the seeding, because I love the garden. So I think that's a great analogy. Seeding of osteogenic cells, which ultimately become osteoblasts. And then I would say probably the other thing to pay attention to is like, this happens first in the diaphysis, and we call that the primary ossification center. And then secondly, it's happening at the epiphyses. Plural form, both ends, and we call those ends the secondary ossification centers. Okay, that's it for this video. Stay tuned for the next. And as always, take care of yourselves and each other.